Ford made this one miscalculation on AI and then had to hire more humans too. The old approach just got more expensive. The practical edge now comes from changing process, timing, and tooling together. We will map trigger, incentive shift, and downstream impact before the close. They thought it would cut costs, speed up production, and eliminate manual work. What actually happened tells you something critical about how AI adoption is going to work across manufacturing. Here's the core issue: Ford deployed an AI system to automate quality control and assembly line decisions. The system was supposed to catch defects faster and optimize production schedules without human intervention. Sounds logical. But within weeks, the AI started making mistakes that humans would have caught immediately. Not small mistakes, costly ones. Parts were flagged as defective when they weren't. Production lines stalled because the AI made conservative calls to avoid risk. And worst of all, the AI couldn't adapt when supply chain issues forced line changes that weren't in its training data. So what did Ford do? They hired more humans. Not fewer. More. They brought in quality auditors, line supervisors, and decision makers to sit alongside the AI and validate its calls. In effect, they built a human-in-the-loop layer on top of the automation they'd bought to eliminate the human loop. This is the miscalculation that matters. Ford didn't account for the cost of oversight. They didn't budget for the training time. And they didn't predict that the AI would be confident in its wrong answers, meaning humans had to actively second-guess it rather than just monitor it passively. Now here's where it gets interesting from a systems perspective. This isn't a Ford problem. This is a manufacturing problem. Every automaker, Toyota, Volkswagen, Tesla, everyone is running the same experiment right now. They're deploying AI into environments where a single wrong decision cascades down a supply chain worth millions of dollars. And they're discovering the same thing: AI is great at pattern matching in controlled environments, but manufacturing isn't controlled. Supply chains break. Suppliers change specs. Equipment fails unexpectedly. Humans are still better at handling the edge cases. The second implication is about hiring. Ford isn't cutting jobs with AI, they're redistributing them. Instead of assembly line workers doing repetitive tasks, they need highly trained decision makers who can understand what the AI did and why it was wrong. That's a different skill set, higher pay, and fewer total positions. So net-net, Ford probably still cut headcount. But they didn't cut it by the amount they expected, and the ramp-up time was longer than they planned. For investors watching Ford or any industrial company, this signals something important: the AI cost curve isn't as steep as the pitch deck's promise. You don't get a 40% labor cost reduction. You might get 15 to 20%. And the capex for the oversight infrastructure eats into those savings faster than most CFOs forecast. For India's manufacturing ecosystem, this is a live signal about where the opportunity is shifting. India's strength has always been in low-cost, high-skill labor. As Western manufacturers deploy AI and then realize they need more oversight, India becomes the place to staff those oversight centers. Remote quality assurance, decision-making support, and exception handling for AI systems in global supply chains, that's a growth layer that could employ thousands of engineers and analysts without replacing existing jobs. For creators and anyone following AI adoption in manufacturing, the story to monitor is this: watch which companies announce AI efficiency gains, then watch how many of them announce hiring shortly after. Ford's not the only one. You'll see patterns emerge. The companies that are honest about needing human oversight will build sustainable systems. The ones that claim full automation and then struggle will be the ones that face supply chain stress when edge cases hit. So what changes next? Expect more companies to redesign their AI deployments with human in the loop from day one instead of bolting it on. Expect more hiring announcements disguised as quality optimization or decision support. And expect the real productivity gains to be 30 to 40% smaller than what the initial business cases promised. That's not a failure of AI. That's just the reality of deploying it into systems as complex as modern manufacturing. The miscalculation wasn't about the technology. It was about underestimating the complexity of the environment where the technology has to live. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next.